Last time we were talking about some issues and puzzles concerning identity. I guess the last thing we hadn't quite finished up with had to do with a puzzle of identity concerning a piece of metal which at one time was a statue, and then at a later time was a vase. So on Monday, the hunk of metal was a statue. It might be a piece of bronze. And then on Tuesday, though, the hunk of metal gets reshaped, it gets melted, and then reshaped into a vase. So it seems one could argue at that point that the statue was destroyed. So a statue, I guess, might be classified or categorized as an artifact. So that artifactual thing, the statue, when it gets melted, goes out of existence. At least that would be the common sense belief. And then when it's reshaped after melting into a vase is created, comes into being. So on Monday, the hunk of metal was a statue, but on Tuesday, the hunk of metal is a vase. You put flowers and water. So if the statue was destroyed and the vase came into existence, that would make the hunk of metal diverse from the vase. Would be two different things, right? So the statue is not identical with the vase, it seems, since the vase could only come into being via the destruction of the statue. So it's not identical with the vase. But this first statement here, that on Monday the hunk of metal was a statue, tells us that on Monday the hunk of metal is identical to the statue. Right? Read literally, anyway. On Monday the hunk of metal is a statue. Was. On Monday, it is a statue. If that's the is of identity, if that's an assumption, then we'd also be saying that the hunk of metal at one time is identical with the statue. And then by the similar reasoning, on Tuesday, the hunk of metal is identical with the vase. Yes, it is a vase. So the statue and the vase are both identical with a hunk of metal. It would seem that things identical with the same thing are identical with each other, right? Yet the statue is not identical with the vase. So that's our puzzle here, our paradox, right? According to the transitivity of identity, if X is identical with Y and Y is identical with Z, then X is identical with Z. if X and Y are the same thing, and Y and Z are the same thing, then X and Z must be the same thing. 2, that's violated here because the statue's identical with the hunk of metal, and that hunk of metal is identical to the vase, but the vase and the statue aren't identical. So it violates the transitivity of identity. I mean, given the transitivity of identity and the principle that identical things are indiscernible in their qualities and relations, it just couldn't be that a given object was identical with something at one time, but at some other time wasn't identical with it and was identical with something else, which is what we have here, right? So we have a problem. Unless you're willing to give up the transitivity of identity. Doesn't seem to be a good way to go. So how might we get out of this problem? Well, as we were talking about last time, there seem to be 2 main options for dealing with this and retaining our basic principles of identity, like the indiscernibility of identicals and the transitivity of identity. One of these options would be to say that when we say the hunk of metal was a statue and the hunk of metal is a vase, the is there is not the is of identity, but merely the is of predication. So it would be saying that we're ascribing a quality to the hunk of metal. We're in effect saying that the hunk of metal has a certain statuesque quality at one time and a certain vase-shaped quality at another time, but that nothing is thereby created or destroyed. The hunk of metal endures throughout all of this. It's the only thing that exists there. So the hunk of metal statuesque on Monday and vase-shaped on Tuesday. And all that exists is the hunk of metal. We shouldn't say that the statue was destroyed or that the vase is created. Really what you have is a hunk of metal that just changes its shape at different times. The hunk of metal exists all the way through, Monday through Tuesday. Nothing was destroyed on Monday. The statue was not destroyed. It's just that the hunk of metal lost the quality of being shaped in a certain way on Monday and takes on a different shape on Tuesday, and nothing's created on Tuesday. It's just that it takes on a vase-shaped quality then. So these would be accidental or contingent qualities of the piece of metal, being a statue and being a vase, would turn out upon deeper reflection to be contingent, changeable qualities of a piece of metal. So that's one solution. In many ways, that's the simplest solution. But it seems to conflict with our common sense beliefs. Our common sense belief is that if you melt a statue, you've destroyed something. And if you shape a vase, you've created something. So that something goes out of existence when the statue is melted, and something's created when the vase is shaped. So if we don't like that first solution for that reason, that it does some violence to our common sense belief system, to our folk ontological conceptual scheme in which things, artifacts like vases and statues come into being and pass away under these kinds of conditions. Then we'd have to come up with a different account. And that account would require saying that the vase is other than the piece of metal, and that the statue is also other than the piece of metal, which would mean that on Monday we'd have two different things there. We'd have a piece of metal and a statue, both in the same place at the same time, making it kind of crowded in there. We'd have these two things, two separate substances, or two separate individual things, co-occupying the very same place at the very same time. And likewise on Tuesday, there'd be the piece of metal and a different thing that was co-occupying the same place at the same time as it, namely the vase. So you'd have the piece of metal and the vase also, but they'd be diverse from each other in the same place at the same time. From the point of view of a principle like Occam's razor, which says don't multiply entities unless you have a very good reason, the question would be, is there a good enough reason to multiply entities here? And I guess the answer would be, well, the reason is that we're trying to capture our ordinary beliefs about what exists, and that they, on the face of them, should be accepted until they're shown to be wrong. So it's kind of a difficult question to settle. Which is better, having two things in the same place at the same time, or having a simpler, having two things in the same place at the same time that accommodates our ordinary belief that statues and vases are created. Is that better? Or is it better to simplify things and just say we have a hunk of metal that changes its qualities over time, and it's the only thing that's really there? So we just have one thing in that place at a time, the piece of metal, and it just changes its shape. That's simpler, but doesn't do justice to what we ordinarily believe. Or should we give up what we ordinarily believe because it's really messy to have two things in the same place at the same time? So that's the challenge, is to figure out which view is preferable here. You know, if we say that there are two things in there, then it looks like we're going to be saying that being a statue is a necessary property of statues, a de re necessary property, and being a vase is a de re necessary property of vases. That, in other words, that being a statue and being a vase are essences of statues and vases, respectively. The piece of metal is a separate thing that exists there, that is in the same place as the statue and the vase. The piece of metal endures throughout. The statue and the vase exist for shorter periods and are separate in their existence and identity from the piece of metal. So it's because these statues essentially or necessarily a statue, that it's its nature that when that quality is lost, the statue goes out of existence. And when the quality of being a vase is instantiated, then the vase comes into existence. This leaves us, though, with a further thorny question. What exactly is the relationship between the piece of metal and the statue? What exactly is the relation between the piece of metal and the vase? That remains a somewhat murky issue that the defender of the common sense view is going to have to deal with. If you deny the common sense view, you don't have to deal with that, but you do have to give up, be at odds with common sense and say that people are deluded when they believe that statues and vases are created or destroyed by melting and crushing and all kinds of things like this. All right, so let's go on to another one of these kinds of puzzles. It's a famous problem that goes back to ancient Greece of the ship of Theseus. These puzzles of identity are related to each other. So the story is told about a very ancient ship back in the days of ancient Greece, owned by Theseus. So the ship was made of planks, wooden planks. I guess it'd be a lot of planks, but we could simplify it just by having fewer planks. So suppose, let's see, suppose this is the ship, and it's made of, say, plank A, right? Plank B, plank C, plank D, and plank E. Right, or chunks of wood or whatever. They were, right? So this is how the ship originally starts out, say on Monday. What happened is ships, sort of have wear and tear on them as they sail around in the ocean, right? The salt water is corrosive. You get barnacles growing on there, and little holes. Right? So if you don't maintain the ship, right, eventually it'll sink. Right? So as various planks became decayed, they were replaced by new planks. So as they aged, as part of the maintenance of the ship, the planks weren't totally destroyed or anything. They just became, right, sort of grungy. Discarded them and replaced them with brand new planks. So first, say, whatever, Tuesday of the following year or whatever, they replaced one of the planks of the ship. So they replaced A with a brand new A prime plank. Maybe instead of A prime, I'll call it, let's see, we'll call this Z. So we replaced A with Z. And then they took A over here and like put it in like a discard pile. So A got taken out, a new plank Z got put in there, and they took A out and stuck it over here. And then at a later day, Wednesday, whatever, B got replaced. So Wednesday, the ship's going to be made of Z. And Y, right? So we replace B with plank Y, and then B gets put over here in the discard pile here. Okay, and then on Thursday, they're going to replace C because it's getting like worn out. All right. So what's C going to get replaced with? X, right? So now on Thursday we're going to have it's going to be made of Z, Y, X, and D and E. And X goes, and C goes over here into the discard pile. All right. So now Friday, they're going to replace D here because it's getting worn. So now we've got the ship is going to be made of Z, Y, X, and so D is going to get replaced with what? W. And D goes over here to the discard. And this one is still E. And then Saturday, right, and these days could be like separated by a year or something like that, doesn't matter. Assuming that they have to be replaced like on consecutive days. It might be a long time, like several years between each of the changing days. Finally, the last remaining of the original parts, E, is going to get replaced as it's got worn down. So at that point, we're going to have the ship composed of Z, Y, X, W, and V. V replaces E, and E goes over here to the discard pile. Okay, so it looks like the ship of Theseus there is on Saturday composed of Z, Y, X, W, and V. Theseus could say, that's my ship. Right? I've been maintaining it over the years, right? Like your car, right? You replace spark plugs, and the engine and the brakes, and, right, over the years. Maintenance, various parts could get replaced, right? So it seems like we have one candidate of the ship of Theseus here, actually the only one now, except that some bright guy got the idea of going to the discard pile and putting together a ship out of the discarded planks over there. And so he puts it together exactly as the ship was on Monday. he's going to make a ship A, B, C, D, E, made of the original A, B, C, D, E that originally made up Theseus's ship over here. So now we're going to have a ship here on Saturday, because he does that on that same Saturday. Here that's made of A, B, C, D, and E. So we have ship 2 here, and ship 1 over here. So which one of these is Theseus's ship is the problem. The argument for that one being Theseus's ship is it's got all the parts that Theseus's ship originally had arranged in exactly the same way, right? So it seems totally identical. It's made of exactly the same things that the ship originally was made of, put together. The argument for ship 1's being Theseus's ship is that it was the one that Theseus continuously had, right? It started out as his ship. It was his ship on Monday. It was his ship on Tuesday. It was his ship all throughout here, so it was just that, right? It changed one of its parts here so that it was made of Z, B, C, D, and E, and then Z, Y, C, D, E. So it seemed like it just changed slightly at each point and remained the same ship all the way through. So one side could argue that ship number 1 is Theseus's ship. Other side could argue that ship number 2 is Theseus's ship. So which is Theseus's ship? It doesn't seem possible that both could be Theseus's ship. It's like they're 2 different ships there. One's over there and the other one's over there. It doesn't seem like one thing can be in 2 different places at the same time and made of totally different matter and be the same ship. Clearly there are 2 ships on Saturday, ship 1 and ship 2, which are diverse from each other. So they both can't be identical, one and the same with the very same ship, Theseus's ship. So which of the 2 is Theseus's ship is the puzzle. And if one of them is Theseus's ship, why is that, as opposed to the other one? So that would be the problem of the ship. Seems pretty vexing, right?
Whichever one is Theseus's ship is in his possession.
Right. Yeah, but it's not just a matter of legal possession, but of identity. But, which one of the 2 objects is actually the same individual object in question? Yeah, there's no doubt that Theseus owns on Saturday the ZY X WV composed ship, but the question is that identical with this A, B, C, D, E ship that existed on Monday, right? Or is it this A, B, C, D, E ship on Saturday that's identical with the same thing as that one there? That's so what would common sense say? Is there a clear answer from common sense about this, or are we just puzzled?
I'd say ship number one, because if you're, again, from a common sense point of view, if you're not looking at it from sense of ownership, for some reason I'm thinking of
Yeah.
Roman legions, because I'm thinking archaeology, but
Uh-huh.
if you had, like, they were numbered, Legion 1, Legion 2, Legion 3, et cetera, at some point, some of the soldiers would retire and sometimes become mercenaries. If you had the entire regiment that was, like, they all ended up retiring and became a mercenary band, that would not be the same as the Legion that it is right now. So say all the soldiers of Legion 4 became mercenaries, they're not Legion 4 anymore, they're just a band of mercenaries. They don't have the same identity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I mean, we could say that from the common sense perspective, it's ship one that's identical with the original ship of Theseus because of the continuity of the changes. So there's a continuous path that leads from ship one to ship two where the parts are gradually replaced. And the one that's continuous with the original one's identical with that original ship.
You could also say Monday and Saturday, right? The question you asked, do they share the identity? I mean, they're made up of the same.
The one over there, that was made up of the exact same parts arranged in the same way as the Monday ship. That's the argument for saying it metaphysically is truly identical. I mean, think of this. Suppose you were a historian who wanted to say put the original ships that Columbus used, right, on his expedition when he discovered America. What was the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, whatever. And suppose they had gone through a similar process like this, right? What would you say? I suppose you could actually find all the original pieces of those ships. They'd been discarded over the years in the same kind of way. And the ships were these brand new things, right? Made out of 20th century materials now because they'd all been maintained and replaced and so on. But you could actually find all the discards and then reconstruct the composition of the original ships. Which one would you want to put in the museum? From the common sense point of view, as the original ship. There it seems like our intuitions go the other way, doesn't it? That we'd want to reconstruct the original ones out of the original stuff and have them in the museum, not these like brand new ones. Right? So I think there's an so it's sort of a dilemma, right? I mean, our intuitions seem unclear by that argument. I'm not saying that refutes the other, because we have the intuition that continuity is what's needed for identity. But I think we also can think of cases where having the original composition is the thing that tips the scale towards a judgment of true identity. Does that example have any pull for anyone? Or not? You feel the tension. I mean, you can be pulled in two opposite directions. I mean, do you feel like there's any pull there? You'd want to put like this. Suppose the ship was actually, the planks were replaced with aluminum planks now, gradually. Because you can make ships out of aluminum too, because it's light. So imagine you replace the original planks, of which were wood, with aluminum. So you wind up with this totally, at the end there, this aluminum ship, whatever. And then the discarded one is made of wood, like the original ship. And again, right, there's this pull towards original composition as being important to identity, as opposed to the continuity story. So I think there are two, like, opposing sets of intuitions under different circumstances here.
Yeah, I can't choose either one because I think
You see what I mean? Once you start putting aluminum planks in. then it seems like the case for that one being the ship becomes stronger, right? When you think of that.
Could you apply the, I'm trying to find my notes, but I can't remember who said it, but it was the idea that you can't step in the same river twice.
Right.
Could you apply the
That's
same logic?
Heraclitus,
Yeah,
yeah.
could you apply the same logic since when he declared that this was his ship, at that point, all the boards began to be changed, but not necessarily the same ship?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that would be what the guy who argues that the Saturday ship that has the same original composition as the original one is the true ship of Theseus, or at least closer to the ship. I mean, it lost some molecules or whatever, right? But imagine you know, it didn't lose any stuff. You just replaced it because it got dirty or whatever, right? And you could scrub the dirt off, whatever, right? Polish it up, and it would be exactly, have all the same parts as the original. Yeah, so that would be the problem. The problem there. So it's a puzzle. This takes us to another example, which I think will shed some light on all this. I mean, I suppose if if you say the ship maintains its identity through some of the changes, but not all, but when you get to the final one, it's not identical. Then you're going to have one problem you're going to have is where do you draw the line, right? Like how much change do you allow, right? It seems like the only thing you could say is not more than 50% or something. Right. But if you say that the final ship's not identical with the original, but all the ones in between are, then you violate the transitivity of identity, of course. So that's not going to be an option. Okay, so this next problem, which is related, is called the problem of increase. It's going to bring out, I think, some of the fundamental issues that are lurking here. The problem of increase. This is the problem of how can anything get bigger? Like if somebody says a certain thing got bigger, like a house or a glacier or whatever. Right. So how can something get bigger aside from stretching? So bracket case where something gets bigger because it's stretched. Yeah, like a balloon or something like that, or a rubber band. Yeah, right. Yeah, through adding on stuff, right? How can anything get bigger aside from stretching? So suppose you start out with some object called A. So you're saying the way that A could get bigger is by adding something onto A, right? And we can call that B. So B gets added onto A. So we add B on here. It seems like that's how getting bigger or growing would occur in this sort of simple representative case. But it's puzzling, huh? Did A get bigger? Here? A didn't get any bigger, right? It's exactly the same size as before, right? You see that, right? A got no bigger, so did A get bigger? The answer is no. A is exactly the same size as it was before, right? You can see it's there and it hasn't changed its size. We added B onto that, but A is still the same, right? Did B get bigger? No, B didn't get any bigger. We had B like over here someplace, and then we attached it onto A here, right? Using adhesive. Or maybe you just press them together really hard and they fuse, right? So did B get bigger? Again, the answer is no. And then I guess we could ask, did AB get bigger? No, because it,
Same amount of things, they just moved closer together.
yeah. Actually, AB didn't exist, right? So it didn't get any bigger. To get bigger, a thing would have to exist, have some size, and then at a later time be a bigger size than it was. But AB didn't exist at all when we started. It only came into existence when we attached B to A, right? So it didn't get any bigger. I suppose if you said that AB existed as a scattered object at the earlier time, then it seems like it got smaller, actually, right? It covered like this bigger area before, if you believe in scattered objects, right? Like the solar system or something, right? If you made that move, it actually got smaller, not bigger, right? When you push them closer, attach them. Yeah, so AB didn't get bigger either. I mean, I think the natural view is to say it didn't exist until it was joined, in which case it didn't have any size. Since it didn't exist, it couldn't have size, so it couldn't get bigger. It came into being when it was attached to AB, and then it had whatever size it had then, but that's not anything getting any bigger than it was. So AB didn't get bigger. So what got bigger? That's our puzzle. Increase. So let's put our thinking caps on here. What could have got bigger? Well, if it's not A or B or AB, then what would it be? I guess there'd have to be something else around that did get bigger that was other than A or B or AB. So what might that be? Well, I mean, there are a number of possibilities depending on exactly what we have here. I mean, suppose that's like a house and you add an addition on, like another, like an extra bedroom, porch, and that's B, right? So what would have gotten bigger than possibly?
Did you say that the space around the object got bigger? If we were supposed to be edited, the space around it.
It seems like the space around it is the space around it.
But I think it's. I wish I had a word that.
Could you say it's like, something like with the house example, could you say it's like C and A and B are just rooms? So when you're increasing it, C isn't typically in existence. So it's like, that's like what's actually getting bigger. Like C is the house. And
Okay.
if you have A and B are rooms, well, you only have A to start with, so C is A or equal, but then when you put B on there, C actually gets bigger.
Okay, so the idea would be that in addition to these pieces of matter, which are A and B, there's an additional thing,
Yeah.
which we call a house. And it's the house that got bigger, but the house is other than A or B or AB at any of the relevant times, right? So that would be one possible view. So we'd have to say that at the original time here, when we started with A, we had two things, right? We had A, which is material stuff like chunks of brick and wood and so forth, right? All joined together. And then we have a house, which is a different thing than that. So we're back to this idea again of two things in the same place at the same time, right? So that would be, we could say, my house got bigger. Or my ship got bigger, or whatever, right? That's right. My statue got bigger, whatever it was. The alternative would be to say that nothing can get bigger by the addition of parts. So we could say nothing got bigger, right? I mean, that would be the other alternative. We could say, well, my house got bigger, or nothing got bigger. If we buy the argument, saying nothing got bigger. Right? If you say nothing got bigger, you're going to be committed to the doctrine that's often referred to as mereological essentialism. According to mereological comes from the root meros in Greek, which means part. So mereological essentialism says that the parts of a thing are necessary to the existence of the whole, and that nothing can change its parts. So this would go back to that Heraclitus view you were referring to, that if anything changes its parts even in the slightest way, strictly speaking, that thing goes out of existence. So when we took one of the planks out of Theseus' ship, when we replaced A with Z on that first day, if we were mereological essentialists, we'd be saying that the object that existed there, whatever it was, a ship or a bunch of boards that are attached together, necessarily has the parts that it has. So if you take any of those parts away or replace them with other parts, you no longer have the identical thing anymore. You have a different thing, which for practical purposes we may not care to distinguish from the first, but strictly speaking it's not the same thing because it's made of different parts. So it's a different, numerically different thing. So the mereological essentialist believes that a thing's parts are essential to its existence. In other words, that if for any x, if y is part of x, then x necessarily has y as a part. Saying that it's impossible for anything to ever lose a part and continue to exist. It would cease, it would go out of existence if the part was removed. So then it wouldn't be possible for a thing to either get bigger or smaller. Right?
What is the
Because that would be a change of parts.
neurological essentialism say about, I mean, that's the idea that if you remove something, it's someone does the same thing, but what about adding something onto it? It's still, the whole is still there, you just adding something onto it. Does that still keep the identity, or?
Yeah, but you haven't made it, you haven't added anything to it. Right? I mean, yeah, the original thing can still be there, but the thing you added to it isn't part of it. It's just like a thing stuck onto it. A is still, has exactly the same parts it has when you stick B onto it. So A didn't get any bigger. Right? A does exist still, and so does B, and so does AB. But you can't make AB any bigger than it is either. If you add something on C to it, then you just have three things there, all of which are exactly the same as they were. Yeah.
What about like the case of the universe? Like, I'm not a physicist, so I don't really understand that, but scientists are claiming that the universe is always expanding. Are they merely saying it's stretching, or are they saying there's time and space being continually added on? I don't know. Again, I'm not a physicist, so. But that seems to suggest that things actually are getting bigger, unless it is just the case of things that are just being stretched.
I think what they have in mind when they say the universe is expanding is that space and time are
So
getting bigger, but not the object.
not necessarily a physical thing.
Yeah, not a material object. Whether that's a case of stretching or not is unclear.
Yeah.
It might be. Not clear exactly. I mean, often it's analogized to a balloon, right?
Yeah.
That's getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
That's why I assume it is just stretching.
Yeah, maybe.
I don't know.
It would be at best some kind of analogy. Clearly, space and time aren't stretching in the way that a balloon or rubber band stretch. But what they say is that space and time, space grows larger as the objects in space move away from each other. They're saying every galaxy in the universe is moving away from every other galaxy in the universe, and then that's causing space to expand. That assumes a relational theory of space, which we'll talk about later in the course. If you believe in an absolute theory of space, then you might just believe that space stays the same size and that objects are expanding into it, but that there's an infinite absolute space that's just there, and the objects are just moving out into it. That's not what most scientists nowadays assume. I mean, there's a big dispute between Leibniz and Newton about whether space was dependent on objects or not. Leibniz said space is a relational thing, and it wouldn't exist unless there were objects that were interrelated. Newton said that space exists absolutely, so you could have, like, all objects vanish and space would still be there. It doesn't, it's a container, so to speak, a ethereal container of everything. Whereas for Leibniz, space won't exist unless there are objects that are related to each other spatially. Now, objects for him inherently contain a spatial, even if you have one object, so long as it's not just a point, it has spatial relations already, right, like length and so on. But for him, those kinds of properties are fundamentally properties of the objects, and then space is a construction on that. So the things that fundamentally have geometric properties for the relationalist are the objects. It's got a length and a width and all that sort of thing. And then if you have objects that are related to each other, you can start mapping out directions and distances and all these things. All you really need is more than one object, and they could even be parts of the same object. I mean, if you just have this one piece of chalk, you've got space, right? It's got a length, an inherent internal length, and dimensions, and so on. That's what the relationalists think. However, the absolute space people, like Sir Isaac Newton, think that space exists independently of whether there are any objects at all. You could have a totally empty space, and it would still be there. So, as to whether space is expanding or not, I guess it would might depend on whether you are a relationalist and argue that it is expanding because the relations between things are getting further and further. Things are moving further and further away from each other, so relationally spaces gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But for the absolutist, they might say space isn't changing at all. Objects are just moving into previously uninhabited spaces that already are there. So we'll talk about that when we do the unit on space and time. But the focus here is on how material things can grow. So the mereological essentialist says they don't. Basically, they don't get any bigger. The pieces of matter and such that exist necessarily have the parts they have, and they can't be any bigger or smaller than they are. Otherwise, they go out of existence. And you're just talking about the parts of those things.
Would you say it's the same problem for decreasing as well?
Yeah, but I mean, it's not exactly the same problem. It's the problem of decrease. But yeah, you could make the same problem. What got smaller? Run through you get the same argument, right? Suppose how does anything get smaller? By taking something away from it. So we start out with A here, right? And then how does it get smaller? By taking away some part of it, right? Like B here. You cut out B. Then the argument's going to be, but a thing can't lose any parts, so A doesn't exist anymore if you take B away from it, so it didn't get smaller, it just ceased to exist. If you're a mereological essentialist. If you're not a mereological essentialist, then you're going to say that there are two things in the same place. There's A and the house, and while A can't get bigger or smaller, the house can get bigger or smaller because the house has different conditions of identity. It's a separate being. Mereological essentialism doesn't apply to artifacts. It only applies to the matter of the artifacts. What's the relation, though, between the artifact and the matter? I mean, they're both in the same place at the same time. What relation does the matter bear to the artifact? If you're willing to accept this idea that you have two or more things in the same place at the same time in this scenario. So like if you had a house, you have the house and then you have the matter of the house. What's the relation between the two? Well, one might say it's the relation of being in the same place as. The co-occupation of a place relation. So that'd be one possibility. Right? So it's when the matter's in the same place as the house, we get this situation. Right? So artifacts are in the same place as the matter. So that'd be one possibility. That wouldn't seem to work in general, though. It's not clear that the relation is just that simple as that. And it's also, of course, questionable. It leaves us with the question of how these two things can be in the same place at the same time, of course. But there are other examples of things that are in the same place at the same time that don't seem to be anything like this. For example, the color of a ball on the ball, right? The color of a ball and a ball are in the same place at the same time, right? Assuming the ball's the same color all the way through, right? Some balls are just sort of like colored on the outside, right? But assume the thing's all colored the same way all the way through. Or take the surface of the ball and the color of its surface. They're in the same place at the same time. Yeah, that doesn't seem to be the relation that holds between matter and the house. Right? A final example comes from physics. According to the physicists, two fundamental particles can be in the same place at the same time. Like two bosons can be in the same place at the same time. Like two photons of light. Remember the example of two flashlights shining, the one shining this way and the other shining like that way. The beams just go through each other without disturbing each other whatsoever, showing that, suggesting that the particles just go right through each other, which is what the physicists say is happening in that sort of case. Particles can just go right through. So at some point they co-occupy the same place. Again, that doesn't seem like the relation here, right? Seems to be a very different relation. So it doesn't seem like that's the relation, merely being in the same place at the same time. So what other relation could we have? Well, we might say that it's the relation of serving as. A serves as my house on Monday, and AB serves as my house on Tuesday, and so forth. So you might say it's the serving as relation. There's some problems with this one as well. I mean, it seems to work for artifacts, but on the other hand, there are also perhaps natural objects that we think can grow and change their parts, like a glacier. It would seem odd to say that, like, this piece of ice serves as the glacier on Monday, and like some bigger piece of ice serves as the glacier on Tuesday. And it seems like serving as implies some kind of relation to the mind that we use, right? That we use it in a certain way for a certain purpose. That wouldn't be true of the glacier. The glacier doesn't have any purpose; it just exists in nature, or whatever. But it seems like it can. We can talk about it getting bigger or smaller as well. But I guess if we confine ourselves to the case of artifacts, we might want to talk about serving as a possible relation, limited just to that case, that sort of case. Right? Living things also need to be considered. I don't want to go too much into detail on that now. There are also natural objects like trees and cats and so forth. They get bigger also. Right?
So it was confusing because I was thinking applying this to, like, say, skin cells. If you, like,
Yeah.
if you scratch your arm, your skin cells are not the same. You know, have the same identity anymore since you've lost parts.
Yeah. Yeah, no, so if you're a mereological essentialist, and if you believe that the living organism is identical, you know, to a material or physical object, then it looks like you're going to have to deny identity to it too, because it changed its parts. Right? If you're a strict if you say we erased it, but it said for any x, right?
Right.
If y is part of x, then it's necessarily part of x, which means that if an organism lost a cuticle or whatever, or a cell, right, it would cease to be the identical organism and be replaced by some other one. That seems absurd, though, right? And it's hard to give up that we ourselves exist. I mean, it's one thing to say that there aren't really houses, they're actually just boards or whatever, but it seems more difficult to say that we don't exist because we have this sort of self-evident awareness of our own existence that Descartes wrote about, right? That I think, therefore I exist. It'd be very strange to deny our own existence. Like, who's doing the denying, right? Right? Yeah. So, living things, I think, you know, raise a whole other bunch of issues that we might want to treat them differently than artifacts. They're certainly not artificial. Artifacts are sort of things that living things create for purposes, like humans create statues and vases. Birds create nests, and so, right? Beavers build dams. So have artifact or artifact-like objects that are created for a purpose with a certain goal by a living creature. Right? In some sense or other, has a goal or a purpose in mind. I saw this really cool thing on the internet last week about how they showed that it turns out that even bacteria can see. I don't know if you saw this article. They found out that certain bacteria, the whole bacterium is like a globule, and that globule actually serves as a lens. The whole creature, like the creature's a big eye. It's just a tiny microscopic bacterium. But it's actually imaging things around it, and they calculated that the visual data it was getting was pretty similar to what like we see with our eye, except a little blurrier. Like you could actually like see like that there were like it would have an image of whatever microscopic stuff there was around it. It's a little blurrier than our image, but there's an image, and it actually, in some sense, is perceiving its environment and modifying its behavior based on the data it's getting through this visual input, which is a completely mind-boggling concept, I think, that would turn out to be the case. You'd be having, vision in some sense without any kind of nervous system whatsoever, which would be really ramped down like the level at which you might think that consciousness, some kind of awareness or psychology can arise. We wouldn't normally think that bacteria could have any kind of psychology, but maybe that assumption is more questionable than we've thought because of these new discoveries. We'll just have to wait and see what the scientists tell us about this as they learn more about it. But in any case, living things open up a whole other fascinating chapter, and I think need to be treated separately. But we can say that if strict mereological essentialism is adopted, then living things can't retain their identity very long, and that seems like a bad result. So in general, I think mereological essentialism doesn't seem acceptable, unless you're willing to say that all living things really are identical with a vital or spiritual element. So, I mean, if you were the mereological essentialist and you said living things retain their identity, then you'd really, I think, be forced into saying that all living things or whatever living things you think have identity through time, have some kind of soul in them. So you'd be saying there is a separate thing there that gives the living thing its identity, which is separate from its body, which would be to ascribe a soul to humans and to cats and maybe even to bacteria. In the history of philosophy, certainly that view has precedence. I mean, that's what Leibniz and Spinoza both thought that. Believed in what's called panpsychism, the doctrine that everything that exists in the universe has at least some little bit of mind in it. That even like particles, like electrons and bacteria, and everything's got a little bit of awareness in it. Leibniz drew the distinction, though, between being aware and being aware of your awareness. And he said that only humans have awareness of their awareness. Or maybe humans and dolphins and cats or whatever it is. You draw a line somewhere and you say, dolphins and orangutans and humans, or wherever you draw the line. But clearly, like, the bacteria aren't aware of their awareness, even if they're aware, if you can say that much. So there'll be a line to be drawn between the rational animals and the other kinds of living things. But they believe that awareness is present even in things we consider to be inanimate, like rocks and electrons and so on. That's the panpsychist theory. So living things will have to be treated separately. It doesn't seem like mereological essentialism can be plausibly applied to them. That still leaves open the question, though, about whether we want to apply it to non-living material things, and whether to accept the existence of these artifacts which co-occupy places with material things, where the material things can't change their parts, but the artifacts can change their parts. It's often said that I'll stop just with the observation that it's often said that the relation between the house and the pieces of matter that make it up is the relation of constitution. It's said that the house is constituted by the objects, say A and B, where A and B are the pieces of matter, and the house is the artifact, which is separate from them. It said that the pieces of matter constitute that house at a given time, and the house can be constituted by different pieces of matter at a different time as you replace them, and so So the constitution relation is constituted by, and now we have the question of can we explain what it is for something to be constituted by something else? And secondly, is it really plausible to think that things like ships and houses and statues are constituted by the matter, or would it just be better to say that we have the matter there and that's it? And the matter changes, it can change its shape, it won't grow or get smaller though, it'll just stay the same. So on that note, I'll end today's lecture and we can pick up on Tuesday. Thank you.